Hello. It's been a while. Welcome back. In the past month, I've made one video. I know, it's bad, but there is a reason. And it's very, very simple. I've been in a slump, both reading-wise and also, I guess, creativity-wise. I haven't felt like making a video. I haven't felt like recording anything, I haven't felt like editing anything, and so I haven't because I'm really bad at pushing myself to do things that I don't feel like doing, But I'm finally feeling more up to it, more like I did before I ended up in my little slump situation. I have some videos planned that I really want to make and that I'm really excited to make. I really do enjoy being part of BookTube, and I've missed it even though I've only been gone for a few weeks, and I'm just kind of really eager to get back into it. I want to get back into the flow of things, and I figure, you know what, the best way to do that is probably to finally do the not just one but 2 book tags that I've been tagged in over the past month. It just feels like a good way to kind of get the ball rolling again. I'm quite overdue finally making these tag videos. Over the past few weeks, I have been tagged by 2 different booktubers to do 2 different book tags. This is the first one. We're gonna kick things off with the International BookTuber Tag, which I was tagged in by Bryndis from Bryndis Reads a Lot. She is an Icelandic booktuber, so if you're looking for a booktuber from Iceland, then go on and head over. I'm going to leave a link to her video for this tag and also to her channel in the description if any of you are interested. The title, International BookTuber Tag, is a little bit misleading. Some of the questions are definitely geared more towards non-native English speakers, and so considering we're on a platform where literally everyone is an international, it's not quite the right title for the tag. I do think that these questions, if you tweak them a little bit, then any native English speaker could also do this tag. You're just gonna have to adjust them so that they're easier for you to answer. But as it is right now, it does feel like a tag that's more intended for non-native English speakers. Just a little disclaimer there. I think you'll understand when we get to some of these questions, so we're just gonna jump right in and get to question number 1. So the first question is, where are you from and what is your native language or languages? I am half Norwegian, half Swedish. Swedish was my very first language, but as of right now, my kind of default language is Norwegian, and that has to do with the fact that while Swedish was my very first language, I learned to speak it while I was not living in Norway, and when we moved to Norway, I was still very young and I was very easily kind of influenced by my surroundings. Over the course of my 28 years of life, I've lived the majority of those years in Norway, and so Norwegian has been the language I've needed to use the most. I do live in Norway now, and so Norwegian is kind of the main language that I use in my everyday life. And so I claim Norwegian and Swedish as my native languages, even though I don't really speak Swedish regularly anymore. These languages are so similar to each other. In general, Norwegians and Swedes are able to communicate with each other in their own languages, and you might stumble upon a word here or there that you're not familiar with, but in general you'll be able to communicate. Scandinavia, our languages are mutually intelligible, at least on paper. In practice it works a little differently depending on the person, but on paper they are mutually intelligible languages. And as someone who is half Swedish, half Norwegian, both of these languages are languages that I am very familiar with, that I've used. Danish is trickier. Spoken, it's impossible to understand. For me anyway, I don't understand spoken Danish. Written Danish is a whole other story. Maybe particularly for Norwegians, written Danish is not as tricky to read because a lot of written Norwegian and written Danish is very similar. But yeah, Norwegian and Swedish, I kind of count them both as my native language just because Swedish was my very first language and I understand it perfectly well, and Norwegian is my default language now. That being said, because I'm so familiar with English and because I've spoken it for such a long time, I do also usually label it as a native language, even though I don't come from a native English speaking country. And pre-pandemic, I would have added it as a native language without question, because I know that I have a very decent English accent and I have very good knowledge of the English language. I know how to use it. You know, I have no problem being in an English-speaking country and making myself understood and understanding and communicating. I have no problem with that at all. I can maneuver my way around the English language just fine. Now I hesitate a little bit more because since the pandemic, I've had less and less reason to speak English on a regular basis. I've come to a kind of space where I'm not as confident in speaking English as I was, not because I think that I'm bad at English, but because I was better before. It doesn't come as naturally to me anymore, speaking it, as it used to do, because I used to use it on a regular basis. I did my schooling in international schools where every class, apart from language classes, were taught in English. I studied abroad and the education was in English. I came back to Norway before lockdown and I've stayed here since. And so I've had very little reason to use English on a daily basis in a kind of as regular a way as I used to use it. And I feel like it's gotten really rusty. And I haven't ever felt this way about Norwegian or Swedish for that matter. But even when I was living abroad and I was using English more than I was using Norwegian, I never felt like my Norwegian was getting worse than it was. But that's how I'm feeling about my English now, that it's not as good as it used to be. Not necessarily my accent wise, but like, you know, even though I feel like I'm quite fluent in English, I struggle a lot more coming up with words. And I have to pause a lot more to think what I want to say. And because I think in Norwegian, I have to translate what I'm saying when I say it in English. And it doesn't come as naturally to me anymore as it used to do. And I don't feel like I've experienced that with Norwegian when I was using English more than I was using Norwegian. So it's really, really hard to explain. All I know is that because I feel like my English has declined or gotten rusty in a way that my Norwegian never ever did, I feel like my English is a little weaker than Norwegian. I'm just not quite as convinced by my own English anymore as I used to be. And it's a very weird feeling and I don't really know how to explain it well. And I feel like I haven't really explained it well, so I don't know if you understand. But I still want to put English here with a little like asterisk, just because I know that I have a pretty decent English accent, and I know that sometimes there are people who are surprised when I say that I'm not a native English speaker. I hesitate just a little bit more now to label English as a native spoken language, even though I do think that I'm a pretty decent English speaker, and maybe I shouldn't be saying that. Maybe I should be saying that I'm a native English speaker because I have such a good grasp of the language. But at the same time, it feels like a little bit of cheating. It feels like I'm cheating when I say that I am a native English speaker because I'm not from an English-speaking country and I've learned it as a second language and now it's getting rusty in a way that my Norwegian never did. But again, I don't really have a problem understanding English. I can use it. It's kind of second nature and so I feel like I should put it here. I really don't know if I should consider it one or not. I'm not sure. But just in case, I'm putting it here. Question 2 is, in what languages do you read books? And I read mostly in English. There's a historical reason as to why. A couple, actually. The first is that I started learning English at a very young age, and my parents kind of wanted to help that along by introducing me to English language books and kind of getting me hooked there because they were already reading Norwegian and Swedish books to me. My parents saw the chance to kind of get some English books and kind of get me learning how to read in English too. The books at home really did help. So I was introduced to English reading when I was very, very young. And it kind of just kept going as I was growing older because we did move around a little bit, and the only language that books were consistently available in, regardless of where we lived, was English. And so English language books were the ones I started reaching for because I could read them. And that kind of like carried on when we moved back to Norway eventually. I still kept reaching for English language books, partly because I read a lot of fantasy and there's more fantasy available and of interest to me in the English language. And when I could read English, I didn't see the point in waiting ages for a translation when the English book is readily available. I could just as well read the original, especially in a genre like fantasy, which there's not a lot of books coming out in Norwegian about or within the fantasy genre. Reaching for English language books just kind of carried on as I was growing up, and eventually it just became the language that I was the most comfortable reading in. I was using English far more regularly than I was Norwegian because my schooling was happening in English, and also the books that I was interested in were available in English and I didn't have to wait for translations, and it it just kind of happened that way. That being said, I have recently decided that I want to read a lot more Scandinavian language books, Norwegian language books in Norwegian, Swedish books in Swedish, just because I don't want to neglect the great authors that we have here, just because I'm so comfortable reading in English. I also am not a huge fan of reading translations if I can help it. I just am not. Where a book is originally in Norwegian or Swedish or even Danish, then I'd rather read it in Norwegian, Swedish, or Danish than get an English translation of it. And that's something I'm actively going out of my way to do more of these days. It's part of the reason why my Scandinavian literature series exists here on my channel. It's partly to hold myself accountable and partly also to motivate and encourage myself to remember to pick up Scandinavian language books. So, long story short, I read in English, I also read in Norwegian and Swedish, and then maybe also some Danish eventually, but mostly it'll be English, Norwegian, and Swedish, I think. Question 3 asks, is there a booktube in your native language, and if so, what is the community like? And honestly, I have no idea. I don't know if there is booktube in Norwegian. I've never sought it out. It never even occurred to me that there could be a Norwegian booktube community. I feel like most Norwegian booktubers probably do make their videos in English. I don't know why I think that, I do. Scandinavians tend to be pretty decent in the English language, and it has a much bigger reach. If there is a Norwegian booktube community, I can tell you one thing, it's small. It's going to be really, really small, so I guess it's probably really cozy and intimate, but it's going to be small. I think it's important to underline that Norway is a very, very, very small country population-wise, and, your reach is not going to be large at all. I only learned of other Norwegian booktubers after I made my own booktube channel. So I have no idea if there is a Norwegian booktube community or if there's a Swedish one. I'm sure there is. And I'm sure that it's really cozy, probably really small and intimate. Everyone probably knows everyone. I mean, that sounds like it could be a lot of fun too. And I would love to have been a part of something like that. But yeah, I can't say for sure. I have no idea. I haven't ever sought out a Norwegian or a Swedish booktube community. So I don't know if they exist. But if they do, then they're small and cozy for sure. The 4th question asks, if there is a booktube community in your native language, why have you chosen to join an international one? And I mean, I kind of answered this one already with the previous question. I don't know if there is a booktube community in my own language. I never sought it out, so I wouldn't even have known to join it, even if it is an option. I don't even know if it is. I joined the International BookTube community because, again, mostly what I read is in English, and it feels most natural to talk about the English books I read in English. English is also the language of all the booktubers that I have been watching for years. They're from other places around the world, but everyone speaks in English, and so it felt completely natural to, even though I am not from an English-speaking country, it still felt perfectly natural for me to join the English-speaking booktube community. This was the community that I was familiar with. This was the community that I already knew about, that I already had some insight into. It didn't feel like there was any other option for me, really. So that's why. Question 5 asks, are there any struggles or challenges for you as a non-native English speaker? And I feel like I've gone over this a couple of times now, and maybe a little bit even earlier, in that I feel like it's not that my English is failing me. It's just that I'm not as comfortable speaking it anymore because I'm noticing that I have to think so much more about how to say things in English than I used to do. It came so naturally to me before, and now it doesn't anymore. Not to the same extent anyway. Again, it's not that my English has gotten so much worse. It's just that it doesn't come as naturally to me as it used to do, and I notice the difference. And with that comes challenges when it comes to recording these videos, right? I notice that I need to take so many breaks to think about what I want to say next. You notice it when you see my videos. There are cuts, sometimes quite frequently, and sometimes I manage to go quite a while without having to make any cuts, but usually the cuts are places where I've had to pause, or I go, or I just go silent and I'm thinking. It's because I need to think over what it is I want to say and then how to say it in English. And it takes up so much more time than it used to do. And so that's a whole challenge or difficulty when it comes to recording videos. When it comes to reading, something that has always been a thing for me is I don't have the biggest vocabulary. I have a terrible, terrible memory, and things don't stick. Words don't stick unless I end up using them in my, day-to-day life. And especially now, now that I don't use English as often as I used to do. Words don't stick anymore when I learn them. And so when I'm reading, usually it's not a problem, but occasionally I'll read a book where the author is really, really loving, or like a character is really, really loving to use words that I don't know or that I'm not familiar with, and that I might be able to work out from context what it is they mean, but I still end up having to look up the word while I'm reading, and that brings me out of the story, and that will always, always influence my reading experience and how much I enjoy my reading experience. And so that's kind of a thing that I consider difficult sometimes. I have a quite limited vocabulary. It also bothers me because there are so many things I want to say about my reading experience or about a book that I've read, and I feel like I often end up repeating myself too much. And it's something I catch myself doing only when I'm editing my video, if I even catch it then. And so a limited vocabulary is definitely something that I notice more of when I'm reading, and then when I want to describe the book that I've read. And then another thing that I know even some native English speakers struggle with is classics and old or non-modern English. It's the reason why I'm so intimidated by Jane Austen. As some of you know, one of my resolutions this year is to face a reading fear, which this year I have decided that I'm going to try Jane Austen, give her a real go. I mean, okay, I've tried reading Pride and Prejudice before, and I got a couple of pages in before I gave up because I did not understand. I had to reread sentences so many times, I couldn't do it anymore. I closed the book and I put it aside, and that stuck with me for years. And I'm still really intimidated and really scared to get to Pride and Prejudice this summer. If I do manage to make my way through Pride and Prejudice, really, really try this time, I am going to be so proud of myself. You do not understand. And then on top of the fact that it's not modern English, I always end up looking up words there too, because there are so many like words that aren't really used anymore that I've never heard of and that I've never stumbled on and that I have to Google, and again it brings me out of the story, and it's a whole thing. So classics and books that are written in a non-modern English. I mean, Shakespeare, forget it. I'm not touching Shakespeare again. I have haned my way through Shakespeare at school, and like that was double up, right? No one loves what they're prescribed in school to read, but on top of that, the English was impossible. So for me, there are some very specific difficulties and challenges that I face. These are the only things that I can come up with right now. I still think that they're legitimate challenges, but yeah, they're very, very specific. I don't know if I would have had an easier time if I had been a, without question, 100% native English speaker, only language I knew, mastered it. I don't know if I would have had a different experience, or if, because I do know that there are even native English speakers that struggle sometimes with non-modern English. I really wish that I didn't struggle as much with these things as I do. Question 6 asks, how do you get a hold of English language books? And for me, not that difficult. Not difficult at all, actually. We have two main bookstore chains in Norway. I want to say 2. I'm blanking on any others in any case. I can only think of 2. And no matter which one you go into, wherever you are, there will be an English language section. And if you are after a specific book and they don't have it available, you can use their website and order it home to yourself, or they can order it into the store and you can go and pick it up there at a later date. There's never any problem with English book stock. And I think it has to do with the fact that, or at least I believe that most of the books that are imported to Norway come from the UK. And I think it's probably in large because of our proximity. Most of the publishing dates for books are the same here, and a lot of the covers of the books that we get are the UK covers. So I think that most of the books that are imported to Norway are from the UK, and it makes a lot of sense geography-wise. And so there's no reason why we shouldn't have easy access to English language books in that sense. We do also have like a Scandinavian online bookstore that I use sometimes, and those are really the methods I use to get a hold of English language books. I go to my local bookstore, or I order it online from one of those bookstore chains or from the online bookstore Adlibris. Sweden recently got Amazon, but it's not something I feel the need to use when I have other methods readily available. Our local library does not have a great English selection, so I don't use the library to get a hold of English language books. And used bookstores, there are a few, but most of the books there are in Norwegian. Just because like, if you go into any bookstore, 92% of the books are going to be in Norwegian. They're either originally Norwegian or they've been translated into Norwegian from whatever language they were originally written in. The great majority of books in Norway are in Norwegian. And that includes also in used bookstores. Obviously, the most consumed language of books in Norway is Norwegian. And so the most books that are going to be donated to secondhand stores are going to be Norwegian too. So I have the easiest time getting a hold of English language books through my local bookstores, whether they are the physical bookstores downtown or whether it's online. It takes no time at all to get a hold of them. They come very quickly. The bookstores are pretty good at keeping in stock books that are popular, books that are bestsellers, books that are hyped, books that are selling well, whether that's classics that never get old or new releases or books that have had a sudden resurgence in popularity or anything like that. They're very, very good at having the book that you've recently heard of available, or at least if they don't have it in the store, then they will have it on their website and you can get a hold of it. So it's very easy to use the bookstores here. Question 7 is, what is the best part of being part of the International BookTube community? And honestly, I just think it's all about the diversity. There are so many booktubers and every single one of us has different reading tastes, and every single one of us has found a hidden gem here or a hidden gem there, and every single one of us have books we love and books we don't like, and every single one of us talks about these books. It's such a great way to hear about books, to find new books, or, you know, if you really, really love a book, you'll find someone who loves it just as much as you, and it feels so good to have someone else rave about a book that you've loved or rant about a book that you hated. It feels really good. And it's just fun to be finding books that, you know, you had no idea even existed. You've never heard of this book, but this booktuber loves the book and cannot say enough good things about it. You give it a try and it turns out it's a fantastic book, and thanks to that person, you've found a new favorite book. I've found plenty of great books through BookTube in the past, and I continue to do so now. It's just the best way to grow as a reader. I don't know how else I would have been introduced to half the books that I've been introduced to if it hadn't been for BookTube. I love it so much. It's so much fun. It's fun to be here. As someone who just loves reading and loves books, what more could you want? Honestly, what more is there? So what's the best part about the International BookTube community? The variety of opinions, the variety of books you find. You'll always find someone who thinks the same as you about a certain thing and then thinks completely different about another thing, and you're going to be put onto that book and that book and that book, and you're going to find new favorites and you're going to find new objects of hate. It's engaging and it's fun, and that's the best part. And then the last question is, do you watch other International BookTube channels? And I do. I mean, again, everyone on BookTube is an international, but I do watch non-native English booktubers. They make their videos in English, but they're not from an English-speaking country. Oh, what's the channel called? The Book Leo? She's Dutch, I believe. And I remember she was one of the booktubers that I watched years and years ago, and who I've rediscovered again after joining BookTube and starting to watch BookTube a little more often. She's gotten quite big. She's quite popular. I think that's really, really fun, really nice. So I think her channel's called The Book Leo. I think so. I'll have the channel linked in the description if anyone's curious and doesn't already know, which I'm quite sure you do. She was the first one who popped into my head. Another one that immediately popped into my head is The Mindless Mess, and I believe he's in India. And I recently discovered his videos because of Tolkien. On my For You page, he'd put up a video where part of what he was talking about was, I don't know if it was a wrap-up or something, and he talked about how he was almost finished with Lord of the Rings and how he was loving Lord of the Rings, and, you know, he was reading it at the same time I was, completely, fell head over heels in love with it, just like I did, and ever since I've been watching his videos, he's just having a great time reading. He reads a lot more than I do, which I always find very impressive, and he reads quite a diverse set of books too. I've also discovered some books because of him that I hadn't heard of before. Big fan of The Mindless Mess as well. I mean, there's so many more. But again, on YouTube, everyone is an international, so... And plenty of native English speakers do have heritage from other places as well. And sometimes that ends up influencing what they read and that kind of stuff. And I always find that incredibly fun too. There are plenty of booktubers, whether they are native English speakers or not, that are so much fun. Do I watch other international booktube channels? For sure. Of course I do. And then to shout out a channel I found recently, The Mindless Mess. But that's it. That is the International BookTuber Tag. Thank you again to Bryndis for tagging me. I'm so sorry it took so long to make this video. I'm reminded of how much fun I have making them. I feel like I'm heading back into the zone now, for sure. Anyway, crossing fingers that I don't end up in another slump for a while. It's been interesting experiencing it, and it definitely sucked. I wanted to make videos, but at the same time I really did not. And I tried. Believe me, I tried, but I did not feel like doing it. And so I feel like I needed this little break, and hopefully now I'll get back into a video a week-ish, and then hopefully I'll be able to stick to it. I do have a busy couple of weeks coming up now, so I'm gonna try to get back into it properly. But I feel good about it. That's something. But that's it from me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a really great day, a really lovely week. I hope the book you're reading is a really, really good one, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!